Hello, welcome, good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. I cannot believe that this is our eighth panel today. Sorry, not today, eighth panel this week to celebrate International Women's Day, International Women's Week, International Women's Month. I'd just like to give a quick thank you to a recognition of the land that I'm standing on. Collingwood resides within the territory of the Saugeen Ojibwe Nation, which includes the Chippewas of Nawash unceded First Nations and Saugeen First Nation, and is home to many Indigenous people, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. Thank you so much. We have another panelist that will be joining us shortly. I do want to kind of get everybody excited about what's about to happen here today. We've actually taken a look from the gender data gap within the startup ecosystem through a number of different lenses already. And today is a really exciting lens for which we'll be looking through. And that's through the lens of an angel or a VC. And those are the people who really drive and support and function, drive this startup through a monetary level in terms of equity. And I'd like to kind of bring up a book because I always like to do this fairly close to the beginning. This venture deals by Brad Feld and Jason Mendelson has some amazing information that I'm sure we'll probably get a little bit to today. Hello, Edith, you're joining us as well. I'm just doing an introduction to the panel. Um, Within the startup ecosystem, there are so many different lenses for us to really look at things from. And the purpose of this whole summit is really to take a look at how we can change how startups start. And I use the analogy that affecting change from a corporate level, you have to monetize it quickly for it to be enacted quickly. If you try to affect change from the government level, it happens very slowly. And even if it does, sometimes the people that are driving it get voted out. If we stand up and we stand strong as women, well, we've seen how that ends. So what we're going to be doing is we'll be changing how startups start. So that subtle influence, having a gender informed product, being diversely informed in how you structure your company, being gender informed and diversity informed in how you make your investments, how you sit on a board, how you support from a corporate level or from a government level. And these are the ecosystems that will support this journey of changing how startups start and fundamentally changing what was once considered a niche market. 50% of any market is not niche. Therefore, 51% of the human population should not be niche either. So I'd like to just leave it on that. And thank you to our guest today. Edith Lovato, I'd love to hear a little bit of an introduction from you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me join this amazing event. I'm the founder of WorkTO. I have a background as a startup founder, and WorkTO is a women entrepreneur and investor community of 1.3 thousand members, unsponsored, unfiltered, and it's really about connecting on a truly authentic allyship level. Also, I am the manager of Haltech, and I work with programs there. And I also am a part of an amazing team that's really so incredible about diversity and inclusion and shaping the ecosystem for amazing founders to make it more diverse. And we really love being a part of this event. So thank you for letting us join.
Thank you so much, Edith. And Martha, thank you so much for joining us as well. May I have a little bit of an introduction?
Sure. Thanks, Cindy. So I am a user experience consultant, a general partner for the Toronto chapter of the Women's Equity Lab, fully female angel investment fund, as well as a fractional chief product officer for a startup. So I wear many hats and very excited to be here today.
And I think that's one thing that we find a lot is that investors tend to wear many hats. And I'm going to ask Teresa to chime in as well, because I know you have such a prolific voice as well. Honestly, it's from an angel. We were just talking about this a little bit earlier as well. And I'd like to include your perspective, because some of the questions that a lot of the women will be having today is, I want to get involved, but I only have a little bit of money and I'm not sure how that's going to work. So, Teresa, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm going to ask you to be that voice for those women on this panel today as well. And Teresa, can you give us a little bit of an introduction of yourself as well?
Wow, where do I start? I started my career in the corporate world as a developer and mitigated myself through different aspects of leading the team and projects. Recently taking a cybersecurity course and love being in the startup and scale up ecosystem and wanting to be that pivot point to make things happen. And therefore got involved with Linking Ventures. I'm often asked to mentor, to judge, the connector, and I want to leverage that in this aspect because my daughter and I would like to get into investing. And I guess that we want to be part of a group, a big mind, and get into it on a smaller scale to learn.
And I think that's really important is the learning aspect of it. And that's where we need to really take a look back to your origin story. So I like to always say that entrepreneurs, even investors, they have an origin story that really drove them to this path. And I'd love to find out what that origin story is and means to you from both that entrepreneurial perspective, but also how that's flown into your support as an investor as well. And Edith, we'll start with you, please.
Oh, sorry, I just had a distraction. Could you rephrase the question?
Certainly. Just because we all have our our origin story. So I always kind of like to think of us as superheroes because we're really what drives the economy between being founders and investors. And what is that origin story for you as an entrepreneur side of things and the entrepreneurial side of things, but how that's flown through to your investment perspective as well?
Oh, absolutely. So I became a startup founder because as a person who had given up a lot of my life to being a stay-at-home mom and then helping who is now my ex-husband, build a company, I realized that it was time for me to build my own. And so in that process, I started seeing other founders who had more intersectional diversity than I had struggle further with building their companies. And through that, I started learning about incredible people who were also breaking into venture capital, who had also pushed their way through as intersectionally diverse individuals. And that made me realize that there is this incredible pool of people, entrepreneurs, and otherwise, who actually have disruptive ideas because they're experiencing problems firsthand, and then they try to solve them. And I started noting as I was working my way through the ecosystem, whether I was talking to people in the angel investor space, as we're working with Angel Investors Ontario, or talking to founders, that it was really exciting to hear people who were directly affected by things being able to solve them in a way that was really different. And so that's taken in my perspective that I'm looking towards things that are not part of current trends or current popularity. And I'm really interested when people reach out to me about something that is outlier, because that's really where I've seen that people who make big moves in the spaces for investing, that's where they find the newest opportunity, is not by looking at where currently things are at, but people who are bold enough to actually make a big move towards the future. And so having come up in the ecosystem at the grassroots level, seeing that there was such potential there, it really opened up my eyes to look at founders differently when I was making recommendations for deal flow.
And I like the way you've rephrased that you came up in the ecosystem and really kind of navigated your way through, and we're really getting a sense of the necessity is the mother of all invention with a lot of these components, right? If you're matching a need that you're personally driving or feeling, that pain versus that pain medication versus that vitamin, then there's an opportunity in there to go a little bit further and be supported. And Martha, from your standpoint, what would be your origin story then?
Always a tricky question to answer succinctly. I think if I go way back to my childhood, I grew up with a father who was very driven, who built, immigrated from Spain, built a software company that I never really fully understood because it was very complex and back end, and didn't appreciate until now that I work in the tech sector. And for me, through my own personal career journey, I spent about 12 years in marketing and advertising. I feel like I've had two careers, one in that space, and then in 2016, I shifted over into technology. I've always been drawn to sort of early stage companies and entrepreneurs, but I kind of felt more comfortable being adjacent rather than the actual, business owner per se. So I wanted to find different ways where, again, I could be connected to the sort of the hustle and the energy and the heart that I find that you have with startups, but didn't necessarily want to be, founding them myself. So angel investment, as well as what I do as a user experience coach and consultant, allows me to be part of that space and to meet incredible founders and work with them closely and help them build their teams and their companies in a really gratifying way. And then when it comes to Women's Equity Lab, that was something where I, about five or so years ago, became interested in angel investing, did a program called Female Funders that was put on by a company called Highline Beta at the time. I believe it's still running. And that was very much about giving us a baseline, sort of a theoretical baseline when it came to investing. But when I graduated from that program and I kind of went out and started looking for deal flow myself, I really felt that there was a big gap between, like I was lacking the confidence and hands-on skills to actually implement what I had learned in that course. So when I discovered Women's Equity Lab, which allows basically pulls together in our fund, we have 35 female investors, small check size to kind of come in, we pull our money, we work together. I like to call it like the training wheels of angel investment. It's very collaborative. That gave me, again, this bridge into angel investing that, was with the support of a community around me, which has been great.
And there it is, the support of the community around us is so critically important to the decisions we've made. One of the things that we've really kind of uncovered through, or at least it's been a bit of an aha moment, is that there's a section of the ecosystem that is missing support. And regardless of whether it's becoming an angel or investor or being a founder and driving your business, we have all of these support systems at the very get-go that are encouraging you to get started, and this is how you do it. And then we have all of these amazing support systems for once you're established and you understand how to do it. But there's that middle ground where you've come out of that learning experience and you're supposed to be on your own, and the system sometimes gets, or at least the understanding of where that system is, sometimes gets a little bit lost in our ecosystem. So I think that both of your companies have that opportunity to really grab onto that element of investors that are missing. And Teresa, I'm going to include you just at Elements that talks about I want to invest, but I'm not quite sure how to do it. So I'm going to capture your origin story here as well. And then we'll kind of include you when you have something to say. Please join us into the conversation from that different perspective. But Teresa, what is your origin story?
Well, I was working for IBM at the time and got involved in, was seen as an ecosystem development manager. And I got involved with the ecosystem within that, and then slowly evolved into York Angel Investors, and was participating in that community. And then evolved as my husband created a startup and was becoming ongoing with that. Our money pooled that way. And so now I'm revisiting again every year, where can I be part of that ecosystem now? Because in my wheelhouse is Edis and other great women founders and investors, and thought it's my brain candy, these people. And I want to go, I'm like Roadrunner. Where, how? And this, now that I've met Martha, I'm going, okay, here's another one. Where do I fit in? Where can I? So the more I look, the more I find. I'm getting more and more excited every day, as through all these panels, I'm meeting these great women who are making me think and stretch. And I'm excited about that. So now I'm thinking, okay, here I am, let's go.
And it's about finding that time, and it's a really great place to end, right? Or to begin, I should say. Here I am, let's go, right? It's almost a different version of the Nike side of them. Let's just do it. So when was the first time that you took that you first considered gender as a part of a business decision? Edith, I'll start with you.
So it was actually the startup that really struck me when there was so much intermediation in terms of people finding work. And so my original startup was about people being seen for all of their capabilities, regardless of their gender identities. And I was also talking to other people that were looking in this space about blind hiring. And there was this movement, around how do we get people an opportunity so that people can push their biases aside and just look at qualifications. And so that's really when it sort of really struck a chord with me that we were not making the progress that we should be in terms of equitable spaces. And that we really started to look at, okay, what are the behavioral economics now around how we see gender and other intersectional areas of diversity? And COVID has really been like the biggest, silver lining to all this picture is that we cannot even be willfully blind anymore around this idea that if we can't actually tangibly move the dial, you cannot call yourself an ally. And so I've heard this term now being shared as a label on Twitter, for example, somebody saying that they're a non-performative ally. And finally, what that means is that they're actually truly an ally. They're not just someone who speaks as an ally or who appears as an ally, but they actually tangibly mean that they're going to do something. And if you tap them, they're going to actually endorse you, sponsor you, connect you, be a true ally. And so, because there's this identity of people calling out someone who is a performative ally is someone who is just an ally in word, not in deed. And so I've now seen people who identify themselves as intersectionally diverse communities using that label non-performative. And I think that even though that might be uncomfortable for a lot of people, I really believe that in some places where people have declared themselves as movers in this space, it's now being shown that people who have not been identified, who are really doing lifting the heavy boulders alongside others, they're starting to get seen for doing that work, as opposed to people who used to take the spotlight for doing so, where they were just really talking the talk and not walking the walk.
And that's a lot about what the premise of all of this is. We're trying to take aha moments and then create them into actionable change. So from our standpoint, our aha moments is, well, honestly, it's this summit. It's the 14 different perspectives and bringing those out. Our actionable change is we've developed a valuations platform for early stage technology startups that produces valuations that value being diversely informed and being gender informed right into the company and how they kind of build out. Another example of that wonderful aha moment into actionable change is I've been a member of the Canadian Ski Patrol for 25 years as a volunteer. I taught first aid for 24 of those years. And we teach the universal signs and symptoms of a heart attack as being that crushing sensation in the chest and the radiation of pain up and down the left arm. Universal does not include women. And that's a scary fact that a woman doesn't even know when she's having a heart attack. I've been on accidents. They never appear the same way. And they certainly don't appear the same way as a man's does. And we have, as an actionable change, we have an amazing founder on Friday mornings panel at 9 a.m. Eastern that has developed a cardio health platform specifically for women of color. Because you see, race also plays a significant factor in our biology and how we're dressed from a medical standpoint. And that's what, and I think we'll have to start sharing that hashtag and non-performative ally. I think that is an important place for all of us to leave this panel, this summit, this month, right? International Women's Month, with that on our side, with an idea of what that actionable change should look like. And Martha, from your perspective then, when is the first time that you considered gender in a business decision?
So I think I mentioned that I had a whole career in advertising, and it's not surprising that there's a lot of convenient assumptions that, about the people that brands, market to. in particular, you know, women, about what women need, want, desire, what they're thinking, that kind of thing. So that was actually a big reason why I felt uncomfortable actually at a certain point at the lack of research that's done in that space, and switched over to tech, where there is, you know, there is a lot more research done into how products are designed and developed. So I would say, in terms of in the technology space, a lot of what I do is work with teams to help them understand the dangers of assumptions that go unchecked. And again, there's this convenience to making assumptions because it's neat and tidy. It's easier to design for sort of a single persona, versus really look at the bell curve, look at the extremes, and then also go into the nuances of what, you know, whether it be gender driven, cultural, race, different dimensions, like what users, people need in a product or service. So for me, that's something that is really important, sort of the diversity of lenses that you're looking at, even at the problem definition stage. You know, you can define a problem, but if you're just defining it, for example, from a male lens or from the majority lens, and you're not looking at, you know, marginalized groups or just diverse groups that are experiencing the same problem, you're going to design sort of very specifically for one group, and you're going to alienate or leave out a whole bunch of other people. So that's something that I focus on now. And I think it's so important that when you don't feel designed for, you speak up and you tell companies, brands, products. You really do, because there are teams that are listening. And when you do feel designed for and seen, then you also let companies know. I think there's something really powerful in that people think that it might fall on deaf ears, but having worked at product companies, it does matter.
And I think that's really powerful, feeling designed for. And my daughter brought me this picture in excitement about 2 years ago. And it was, and she said, I finally understand the difference between equality and equity. And being her mom, I thought, okay, well, this is a wonderful little thing. And my eyes opened with this image, very simple image of these 3 equal boxes. And on the other side of the wall was this game. So the man stood up on the box. It was exactly the right size. He was able to see over. The woman stood up on the same equal box and was unable to see over. And the third box, same height, there was a person in the wheelchair that wasn't even able to get up on the box. And this is the design element that we need to consider, that visual element, as we kind of look through everything that we're doing to be able to infuse the difference into things. Now, I also want to kind of bring up the idea of our lens. Another thing that the other panels that we've had already have really brought out is the fact that the lens that we're looking through is not inclusive, whether we're in one of these elements. So myself being a woman, it doesn't represent everybody else's view either. One of the young panelists, we had young entrepreneurs on last night, and she said that her lens is unique to her, and that she felt stifled in school because of all of the stereotypes. So the lens that she had was not her own of her own making. It was one that was forced on her by stereotypes. And it's so hard to say, stand strong, break through all of this stuff when you have all these voices telling you you can't, telling you you shouldn't, telling you that's unladylike or whatever it is. And she said that it was very important for her to feel confident and comfortable in breaking through that lens so that she could be her own unique self and use her own unique lens. So with that in mind, what part of the lens from your perspective do you think we're missing? And Edith, I'll go into you for that.
I think it's the candor of someone to tell you where your blind spot is. So one of the things that has really jumped out at me, also being a mom, is that every generation thinks that their parents are bigoted. And it's when you become a parent yourself that your children or their peers can reflect your unseen bigotry. even, and people bristle at that word, but it's not bigoted in terms of like the big B bigot, but in terms of your small bigotry, your small prejudices, your small biases that are normalized enough that you don't really stick out in culture. But if you have someone who is even more open-minded, more inclusive, more equity oriented than you are, because generationally they're acclimatized to seeing things in a more broad way. That really was what surprised me the most, is having people around you where you signal that you're receptive to hearing truth. And they say, do you really want to hear it? And then they tell you. And so that has been really challenging, but incredibly growth fostering, because at first, your ego takes quite a battering as someone, if you believe yourself to be an ally and to really care, and then your ego has to step aside for you to actually see that you did have indeed a blind spot. And if you get really curious about that, you can start to pick it apart and hopefully see things from a more intersectional perspective that as a generation I had not factored. And I saw this movie called Scarborough, and I remember seeing that up on a big screen. It was so powerful to be in an audience of all sorts of mixed people and hearing people gasp, especially people who are privileged, to recognize that they themselves have been blind to the microaggressions that they perhaps in the past weren't aware of. And that was so incredibly bold to be able to be part of an audience, to experience that in real time together, where you all feel, because of that art form and the perspective taking that was shown to you, you can actually sense what you can get a tiny fraction of that experience of what it's like to be a part of that community that is hurt by bias and prejudice.
That's fair. I actually got goosebumps from that one. We'll have to share in the after notes a link to that film, to that movie, because those are the type of aha moments that I think need to drive everything that we do, and being receptive and having that, surrounding yourself by people that showcase that you are open to people saying, look at this different way. Martha, from your perspective, what are we missing from the lens?
I mean, I would agree in the sense of just even not taking for granted to be conscious of your biases, right? There's a lot of people, I think, that are just at that stage where they're like kind of ignorantly, like unconsciously, unconsciously, not conscious, but just unconscious of those biases that would be coloring the way that they're, treating other people or seeing the world or designing a product or that kind of thing. So again, I bring it back to sort of product development and design, my space. I think the first thing there is, it seems really simple, but we do things called like an assumption jam or assumption dump, and you get the team to sort of put everything they think they know about a particular audience. And then we actually kind of pull that apart and say, okay, what do we actually know with evidence? What's supporting proof points do we have here versus what is based on kind of that first person lens or like, whatever, the anecdotal kind of evidence. And then we look at blind spots. So it's interesting, I guess you mentioned blind spots. That's a really important thing as well in design. So that's where we start to, plan out what research, who do we need to go and speak with? What are our research goals and objectives, and make sure that we're bringing those insights and perspectives back to the product team so that we're designing for the most, like the widest possible audience. So I'd say, and the other thing I was going to mention too, in terms of the lens, like, I don't know, maybe this is slightly different, but I think how I view myself from a lens, let's say from my career or success, or just having the courage to do something totally new and different, I'm very much impacted by the, female mentors and other women that I look up to in my network and circles. So I think sometimes with, that going back to Cindy, what you mentioned about that first, all those voices and all that pressure and the stereotypes kind of creating this self-perception. I think, again, if you have people around you that are helping to balance that out, that you look at and say, that person is like doing their own thing and they're rocking it, like they're killing it. That I think helps to counter that what can be just kind of that group think or kind of obviously bullying and ganging up, that kind of thing, but just in general, just seeing people who are successful, being confident in their own person, carving their own path in life is really helpful too.
And it's about grasping those opportunities to be that person, to stand up and to have those conversations. We had a panelist on the corporate support panel from HSBC who said that they have committees to ask those uncomfortable questions. And I think that that's something we need to be able to give ourselves a forum to be able to ask those uncomfortable questions and invite anybody that's interested in coming in and hearing those uncomfortable questions and being a part of that narrative, and being proactive and what is the wonderful non-performance, and to be a non-performative ally. I have to remember that new vernacular.
Can I just jump in? I love that notion of an assumption dump. And part of one of the things that I'm seeing is really disruptive is bringing mindfulness to the workplace. And there's someone who did a demo with us at Haltech, and I was blown away at the simple act of taking 10 seconds per hour, where even if all you do is you touch your thumb to your first finger for 10 seconds to be in your body for that, how grounding that is. And what that has allowed me to think about with this assumption dump is sometimes making a tiny bit of space. And so I love this idea that understand that beliefs become truth or become reality. And we get really attached to our beliefs. They can be very blinding for lack of a better word. And if we can call them actually assumptions, just putting one layer of distance between your beliefs and then calling them like an idea or a thought, and allowing some space there for you to have some perspective taking on it. And then the idea that you could actually put them out there and you have to articulate them would allow people this opportunity to sometimes see something that they held on to as a belief, and to, even if it's a strong belief, to hold it a little more loosely so that you can have reflection on that, to maybe see something from a different perspective that can disrupt. And I love the idea of that. So I just wanted to echo that. I'm going to bring that idea of an assumptions dump into more conversations to allow people to just shift just a tiny bit away from their locked perspective to open up their mind to see things that they might benefit from, or the group can benefit from that shift. So I just wanted to throw that in there.
And I think that's very powerful to have that 1 degree of separation by being able to put your beliefs out in front of you as assumptions, just enough to be able to take a look at it from a different perspective, and that removed perspective. And I'd like to actually lead that into the next question. And I'd like this one to go around a little bit. So I'll put a link in the chat for anybody that's interested. So I believe it was Jacqueline Kennedy who did a bit of research on how questions were asked to female founders, regardless of whether it was from a female investor or a male investor. The questions tended to be a lot more preventative. And from these panels over the last couple of days, we've also found that does not stop in the investor room. It extends far beyond that as well. There's a lot of preventative language that's being used. And honestly, I went through a revelation over the last couple of years, and I was so tired of being told what I couldn't do. I got back to the business of being awesome, and it was very releasing to be able to kind of use that vernacular to phrase what I was going through. And if we apply that same thing, I think outward, there might be a new way of looking at things. And just as an example of how those preventative questions might come out, and something that I've been a founder a few times, that I hear often is, that is a very saturated market. How do you intend to compete with this person, this person, this person, this person, this person, this person? Some will go on for a very long time naming everybody. And as opposed to getting back on the defensive by going, oh, well, we're not actually like, oh, we're not like, take it forward and be promotional. So the one way to kind of tackle that one is to say, are you asking about my go-to-market strategy? Because it shows that extra confidence. and applying that to everything that we do, taking that negative response and turning it around into a proactive or a promotional response that talks about your solid skills. Let's talk about getting onto that startup board or that advisory board. Know your skills, know your resume, and turn all of that defeatist, all of that negative things around into that positive side of things. Yes, redirecting the narrative. And Edith, how can we then take all of that that negative, what would you as an investor say to be able to make sure that you're asking questions that are more promotional of female founders? And in turn, what advice would you give female founders when they're experiencing that as well?
So that's been really interesting because as part of the Beyond Boundaries program at Haltech, I had the chance to listen in, joining them on their third cohort and hearing certainly the perspective of some women, for example, articulating how uncomfortable they feel when an investor starts to make comments in the Zoom meeting about their appearance and so aspects about them that have nothing to do with being a business individual, and them feeling very triggered by that. And one of the things that I found really powerful is nonviolent communication. And that's a whole philosophy and approach and language. And now there's someone who's created nonviolent communication as a practice and moved it into the mindfulness space so that it sounds a little less robotic and more fluid. And so that people can hear it better. And it's called Say What You Mean. And I can drop a link or share one later with regards to these two books. And so one of the things I found most powerful when someone is triggering it or using a defensive line of questioning, that's also what I've heard it called, where they ask women defensive questions where they have to defend something as opposed to a truly open-ended question that allow people to answer openly. And I said to her, one thing that might be really interesting, unless you're worried about the power dynamic in that line of questioning, is when someone asks you a question that you think is triggering or objectifying or otherwise making you feel defensive, ask for clarification. And so I found this with other individuals who tended to try to be passive aggressive, and I was feeling triggered by that. And I would say, could you explain that to me? Because I'm not quite sure I understand what you're asking me. And when you ask someone who is even sometimes being even intentional or deliberate about trying to make you feel uncomfortable, reflecting it back to them and have them repeat it can be incredibly powerful, especially if there's a bullying sort of theme going on in an interaction. And so that, perspective taking has been really helpful for working with founders who have, been asked defensive questions, is to reflect it back to that individual without, without triggering defensiveness deliberately. It's about mirroring back to them so that they can perhaps see how they're behaving and then come to an awareness on their own, either through being uncomfortable or through being woken up to say, oh, I shouldn't have asked that question. Because sometimes we even misunderstand people because we have a bias that we think that they're saying something deliberately and they may not be. And so it's also helpful to give them the benefit of the doubt instead of being accusatory about saying, this is what I think you're trying to say. Ask them to say, what are you trying to say? And that at least shifts it open, that if somebody didn't intentionally mean that, they can clarify. And if somebody did mean that, they need to be more careful about explaining themselves in that circumstance.
And it's a wonderful way to diffuse, and all of a sudden you kind of feel like you're a part of that that narrative then in a more positive way. And Martha, from your perspective.
I think I just covered that pretty well. It's interesting. So we just had at Women's Equity Lab, we had a regular investor meeting last night. So we had 2 companies come and present, and then we do a 10-minute Q&A after each and use the chat to see the type of questions. So as I'm looking at this article, thinking back to here's a group of women, nothing to do with like male investors. What type of questions do I see a pattern there where we tended as a group to be more promotional versus preventative in our questions? And quite honestly, I'd say there was probably a mix. And I also think that the tone of how these questions is delivered, like these are just written that I'm looking in the article or in the chat, but depending on how an investor kind of says something and delivers it can really change how it lands. So what I think that, is kind of a good takeaway for me is to be like, I'll take this back to my investors and do some education there around as we think about the type of questions we're asking founders coming in to present. Let's be aware, let's become aware of how we're positioning and how we're phrasing these questions. And I'm not sure in some cases that, again, if they're male investors that are asking, I think it probably comes from a deep unconscious bias. But again, if you're a female investor in that group of men, and you can help to, again, enlighten a little bit on after the fact, not in front of the founder necessarily, but after the fact, just spend some time to debrief and talk about what was that experience like from the shoes of the founder? How might we have made them feel with the questions and how we approached it? Because again, if you're sort of feeling that vibe right off the start from the investors, it's a long-term relationship. So I'm not sure that you necessarily, I know companies need capital to grow, and that's really important, but that's also something to think about too, is how are they going to treat you in a follow-on kind of relationship as well if you're already uncomfortable from the get-go.
And I think that's really important to kind of think about it from that perspective, as well as you want to make sure that you're getting in with the right investors that really reflect your values. And as Edith had mentioned, being able to put your beliefs out front as assumptions might be able to help you evaluate how you might actually fit into that partnership as well. And I do want to bring up another book that I had recently read by Sarah Lacey called "A Uterus is Not a Feature, It's a Bug," and it does talk about that bro culture and about how we as women do not have to conform into that bro culture, or trying to be a man or fit into that mold, because we're not. And it's so much harder to become something that we're not, rather than just standing up and using who we are as our place to stand. I do want to take a little bit of a move into the perspective of how can we foster support for women who have no idea how to become an angel. And I'd love to take a look at this from a little bit of Canadian perspective, but also on a global perspective, because we are part of a larger ecosystem, especially after COVID. So what does this look like in terms of check boxes and how we can feel confident to look up the regulations within our country, and what we should look at internally to be able to be an effective investor? And Edith, I'll start with you.
Well, thank you. So one of the things that I thought about when I was working with Angel Investors Ontario is how do we create a more inclusive environment, because the angel groups were so dominantly, unigendered in many cases. And so I started speaking to, who were women angels, what it is that would be disruptive for them to want to join a community of, say, a chapter of women investors that are at the angel stage. And what I heard from one who was one of the most cogent and successful women angel investors, and also a bigger scale investor, is she said, most importantly, I want to be able to know what the skill set is amongst my peers that are in the space of angel investing. So who has what expertise, which is similar to what happens, for example, on AngelList, where you can watch super angels and you can see if they're syndicating something, and based on their history, you could jump in and apply to co-invest with them. So having this opportunity for women to do this, to say, okay, who has, the great expertise in this? Can I build a relationship with them and see who they are, to see if we'd actually want to work together on an investment? And then based on that, show us investments that are in that wheelhouse. So even though, for example, I may not know anything about, I don't know, dog food, for example, but I know an investor who knows tons about animal nutrients, and I really like working with them. I may trust that person enough to say, you're going to be bullish on that investment. I'll join you in on that. And so, first of all, building trust between individuals so that you can co-invest, because it's very difficult to be the first hand to go up in an investor meeting saying, I'll put $5, $10, $50, $100,000 on that company, if you don't feel like you know enough about it. And so women will sometimes take the back seat and not put their hand up for that deal or getting in on that deal, because they don't really know that those other investors who are co-syndicating that particular investment. And so I think that building relationships between individuals, going to angel groups, and now that they're starting to show up in person, trying to work on really, being courageous, which is truly a feat, when especially if you're still in the minority in that community at that particular physical space, and see if you can find other people that you're willing to connect with who will help you, come under their wing, so to speak, during your first investments, to collaborate on a smaller set of investments so you can start to build your confidence in that. And I think that that could be potentially really disruptive, is to be able to wing each other. Because I found this when I was a startup founder, and I would go to events and I would be one of just a handful of women. I ended up bumping into this woman, and I heard her pitch her company a few times to people that wouldn't really come up to her or come up to, but together people would come up to us. And eventually I liked her company so much, I said, can I pitch your company? And so I would pitch it, and all of a sudden those individuals would lean forward and they were so interested in her company. And so it was my endorsement and enthusiasm for what she was doing that made other people interested in her company. And so I have found that to be true also with being able to co-invest. If someone who's not feeling as confident, you actually say, well, I've seen, that you've made the following moves, you have the following expertise, that vote of confidence from someone would, even though like I'm not an expert in that whatsoever, that is how it really works, whether it's on the golf course, in the locker rooms, in those places that are traditionally male dominated. It actually does work. It's just a question of applying those dynamics now to a visible space where you'd say, you put your hand on that person's shoulder and saying, I endorse. And that act of confidence is so huge and needs to happen in a more visible and abundant way.
So I found that very exciting, and I'm just trying to kind of reach back behind me. So my obsession is in first followership, and I have tons of books on it. And I believe it's this one, Barbara Kellerman, first followership, and she actually talks about the courageous first follower. The courageous follower. And I think that this is where, and my philosophy is that we're all built in the startup ecosystem, especially, we're all about that first followership scenario as mentors, as advisors, as investors, as co-founders. There's this string of first followership that goes into play. And that courageous follower that she talks about in here is in a situation where you have a bully and everybody kind of stands back and goes, I'm this innocent bystander, I don't see anything. And it's that courageous follower that stands up and says, listen, you're not doing this right. You need to stop. Perhaps we should just move away from it and diffuse the situation. And that first followership, or that courageous follower in this investment, in this startup ecosystem, will function the same way as that endorsement, to be able to stand beside somebody when you see that their voice needs to be amplified, and give them that courageous support. So sorry, you just inspired me to something. So
Yeah, it's that idea of a temporary champion in that moment that is like catalytic. And I have found that in numerous places. Like, for example, in even though it's so hard in the Zoom world to really connect to people, I've seen moments where we were in a breakout room and a woman pitched her company, and I saw her do it once, and then I was in another breakout room and I saw her do it again. And the third time I said, can I pitch your company for you? And so I did that. And she heard her company articulated in an elevator pitch that she was like, oh my gosh, I'd never thought about pitching my company that way. And so she had a teeny blind spot that I shone a light at, and she was just like so excited. And then my brain just thought it was related to a company that comes in and does painting samples for you. And then if you pick a sample that you like, they'll paint your house. And I said, also just an idea, instead of making people commit to painting on their walls, could you pre-paint canvases that are made out of drywall material? You just hang them up with 3M hooks. And she said, oh my gosh. And so it's that sort of like mastermind moment that just like poof, like happens. I think that there needs to be an environment where we can start to percolate this kind of connectivity, because we're stuck in the Zoom world for quite a bit while longer. And having the breakout room idea figuring out how we operationalize that to allow these like hyper connections to happen, and for people to have that like moment where they heard their company pitched in a way that they now realize, oh, that's how I should be telling people what I do. And this one tiny sometimes idea that could unlock all of a sudden scaling their business from what used to be really difficult, conditioning people to say, I don't know if you want to put paint on my wall, to saying I could just stick it up there with 3M hooks and there's no damage and you could just look at it for a few days. No commitment, no hassle. And all of a sudden she might take that company and that could become, the next $1 million idea if she patents this sort of way of doing things, if she could figure that out. And at a minimum, I saw like that spark light up in her, and that intersection only happened because we were just, I don't know, we just clicked on a personal level of personal enthusiasm to be that person to say, oh shoot, I would love that business in my house because I really would like some color. As you can see, like there's a lot of white in my environment, and if somebody would do that for me, it resonated with me, and I was able to be a first follower for her, even at that intersecting moment where we're just there briefly together. So this breakout room idea, I think there's something there in terms of like colliding people in a way that makes a deeper connection, and figuring out how we can loop that into more and more collaborative style event running things that allow people to really show each other as first followers.
So I make things happen. So I will make that happen. We will start a breakout room. I know that Teresa is one of my biggest supporters in making things happen like that as well. She's looking at me going, oh, here we go again.
Well, to Edith's point is when I do go into a room, I have a lot of people approach me because I've had people say, if you're going to meet one person in this room, go meet her, which I'm totally flattered.
Yes.
But in the breakout rooms in the Zoom that I'm enjoying is that I'm meeting people globally, quickly. And when I go into a room, I'll end up having a 10-minute conversation and I go, do I go left? Do I go right? But now they're 5-minute conversation. And then once that trigger with mutually, we will have a further conversation. So I'm getting way more of my mentorship out and learning, being that tipping point for myself because we're on Zoom.
And the one really valuable thing, there's been a number of them that I've learned from Teresa, is 15 minutes for everybody. And think about it as simple as smiling at somebody as they're walking on the street. That one smile can change somebody's day, their month, their life. And that 15 minutes or that breakout room has the impact to be able to change somebody's life forever. So I think that's a very powerful tool set that I would love to kind of be able to work with you on. Martha, so from your perspective, what do you think, what are some of the tools that we should be looking at in order to foster these new investors and angels and VCs coming up?
I think one of the biggest hurdles, and included for Women's Equity Lab, is the need to be an accredited investor to participate. So, for example, I mentioned it was a $5,000 check size, which for many people is affordable to come in. They may not be in a position to write a $50,000 check or $100,000 check to a company, but as a kind of a combination of investment and education, $5,000 has a pretty wide appeal, especially in bigger cities like Toronto and Vancouver. The challenge is when new people who are new to angel investing, when they see the criteria for to be an accredited investor, that's where there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the risk level the government is trying, basically to protect new angels from, and the size of that check to participate. So one of the things I would like to see change is that there is, that requirement is lifted for a certain small check size, so that we can have more women flowing into these type of programs, because you get incredible networking. As I mentioned, 35 investors in our first fund. We're already planning our second fund, and just seeing, and there's multiple chapters of well across Canada. Like, we're creating this amazing community of women. They're learning as they go. And then the idea is that they're helping to change that. Unfortunately, I think the stat is 2% of VC funding went to female-led startups this past year. It decreased, I think, from 4% previously in 2019. So, that number is just has to change. And I do believe that we need more people at that, at the downstream, at the upstream, at the early sort of source, and help women get into it, really lower the barriers for women to get into it and start to feel comfortable so that they have both the education. An understanding of the risk level is really important, but there's kind of like a shallow end. And it's not just like the deep end of angel investing where you jump in and you feel like it's scary, there's a ton of risk, you're super anxious about it. There's some sort of shallow end that kind of helps you gradually get into that and write, larger checks over time if that's like part of your strategy and what you want to do. So.
And how do we, we're finding out a lot of these inequities as we kind of have these conversations, and this should be the next change that we need to put in place. Who would we approach in the government to be able to enact that change, to start that going? And then I'd love to be able to leave this panel and go, okay, I've got my running orders. Where are we going? So who in the government do I need to go and talk to? Do I need to be able to start bothering and pestering? And
what I'll say from my perspective is I'm definitely not an expert in that area, and I haven't personally done anything active to go and kind of combat that or address that. I know that we have a chapter of WELL in Manitoba that's trying to basically is experiencing this challenge with the accreditation requirement, and they have been speaking to people in the government there. So we can connect after, Cindy, and I can let you know. But they're trying to lobby and actually enact a change so that they can get that program. Because Toronto is very different, like Ontario is very different than Manitoba, and trying to encourage angels to, again, we want it to be as easy as possible, as inclusive and accessible as possible. That's our goal.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's interesting. Edith, can you think of any connections that might be appropriate? I'm just wondering if this is something that can start off as a conversation at the federal level so that it can flow through the different provinces as well. And wouldn't it be spectacular if we were at the forefront of breaking ground on something like this, to be able to introduce more female investors to flood almost more female investors into the environment, and say, this is what we need to do, and have other countries then pick that up and say, yeah, I get it now.
What I think is really relevant is out west, they get tax deductions for their startup investments, and we're not incentivizing Ontarians to do that. And while, for example, if you're investing in Northern Ontario, there's a tranche of investment that gets matched from the federal government, but we don't see that trickle down to Southern Ontario, where there is an incredible, we're being called Silicon Valley North now. And so there needs to be movement in this space, because once we make things that give some people a tax advantage as such, they can logic out how that tax advantage shapes up to favor a demographic if they wanted to. They could put their economists on this to sort that out. It's just a question of providing the right kind of pressure to say it's time that we need to foster more equitable investments. And one of the levers that we can pull on that is, for example, a tax deduction for people who would benefit significantly from that, in order to be able to be included in that subset of investors. That would be the first mover possibility for that. So I think that reaching out to people who are in the economist space to help ideate some of this as part of a brainstorming session, and looking towards how that movement took hold and root out west, and use some of those levers that they pulled to move the government out west, to see if we can apply that to the Ontario government and even the federal government partnering in that as well.
And it comes back, we just have about 2 minutes left. And I think that the resounding pivotal moment that we can put into place right now is that breakout room, that brainstorming room, whether it's for founders, whether it's for investors, whether it's for driving change at the political level. I think that that's something that we really need to kind of bring in to change. And I'll take up on that, and I'll meet with you ladies to see what we can do moving forward from there. The non-performative ally, I want to introduce that vernacular and have everybody start sharing that as the way we live, and not just a hashtag we throw out there. Make sure we're asking the uncomfortable questions, change behavior into assumptions so that you can put it external to yourself and take a look at that. And in order to have that assumption dump, I know there's so much I'm missing, but the reflection. So when you're asked questions, make sure you reflect it, that might be negative, reflect it back and ask them what they truly mean, because by doing so, you're going to give them the perspective that you might be receiving those questions as. Ladies, it has been absolutely spectacular and wonderful. I have enjoyed this immensely, especially considering you jumped in at the last minute. I think this was empowering and certainly has given us a lot of actionable items to go forward with. On the last word, Edith, thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you.
Wonderful. And Martha, thank you so much as well. And Teresa, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Have an amazing day.
You too.